My name is Dr. Aaliyah Washington. On the evening of October 1st, I died for 9 minutes and 47 seconds. Before I tell you what I saw in that eternity, the judgment I was forced to witness, and the urgent warning I was sent back to deliver, you need to understand the woman who died. I was 45 years old, a professor of American history, a wife, and a mother. My life's work, my entire passion, was the pursuit of truth and the fight for racial justice. I was not a woman who believed in half measures. I spoke with clarity, I wrote with conviction, and I fought with a righteous anger that I believed was a gift from God Himself. But that anger, over years of seeing history repeat itself, of witnessing the same cycles of injustice and prejudice play out in new and terrible ways, had begun to change me. The fire that once fueled my work had started to consume me. It was a slow, subtle process. It began as a weariness of the soul, an exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. Then it became a cynicism, a bitterness that started to poison my interactions. I looked at the world and no longer saw redeemable people caught in broken systems. I saw only battle lines. I saw allies and I saw enemies. My love for justice was slowly being choked out by my growing hatred for those I saw as its opponents. I had spent my life diagnosing the sickness of my nation, all while ignoring the slow, creeping sickness that was hardening my own heart. I told myself it was the necessary cost of the war. I did not realize I was becoming a casualty. The night my life ended began like any other Tuesday. I was at a town hall meeting in our local community center. The topic was a contentious zoning issue, but like everything else in our country, it had quickly become a proxy war for the larger culture war. The room was thick with a tense, angry energy. I had come to speak, to advocate for the families in my community who would be displaced by the new proposal. I was prepared. I had my historical data, my statistics, and the righteous fire of my convictions. I sat in the front row, my heart already pounding with a familiar mixture of frustration and resolve, watching as person after person stepped up to the microphone to voice their opinion. Then she stood up to speak. Her name was Susan. I knew of her. An older white woman, a prominent figure in the more conservative circles of our town. She began to speak not with overt hatred, but with something far more common and to me more infuriating, a calm, pleasant, and deeply ingrained ignorance. She spoke of preserving the character of our community and used other coded language that I, as a historian, knew was rooted in a long and ugly history of exclusion. Every word she spoke was a polished stone of prejudice, smoothed over with the veneer of neighborly concern. I felt that familiar, hot surge of anger in my chest. To me, she was not just a woman with a different opinion. She was the embodiment of the very thing I had spent my life fighting against, the polite, smiling, and deeply entrenched system of injustice. When she finished speaking, I was the next one at the microphone. I did not address the zoning issue, I addressed her. My voice was calm, my tone academic, but my words were a scalpel, intended to cut through her polite facade and expose the ugliness beneath. The exchange was sharp, public, and brutal, and in the end, nothing was gained. We were two people speaking two different languages, from two different worlds, with a great and impassable wall of our own certainties between us. I walked away from the microphone, my body trembling with a rage that felt both righteous and toxic. There was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, and my blood felt like hot acid in my veins. I had won the argument, I suppose. I had spoken my truth with unflinching clarity. I had exposed her ignorance for all to see, but I felt no victory. I only felt the cold, hard satisfaction of having wounded an enemy and the profound, soul-deep exhaustion that came with it. I found my seat, my heart still hammering against my ribs, a wild and angry drumbeat. I looked across the room and saw Susan being consoled by her friends, her face pale and shaken. I felt a grim satisfaction. Good, a cold, hard thought echoed in my soul. Now you know what it feels like to be put in your place. My last thought on earth was not of my husband or my children. It was not a prayer to my God. My last conscious thought was one of pure, unadulterated, and triumphant anger toward the woman across the room. And it was in that exact moment of my most righteous hatred that I felt a sudden, blinding flash of light behind my eyes, followed by a sharp, electric pain, as if a wire had snapped deep inside my brain. The angry, buzzing sounds of the auditorium instantly warped into a long, distorted drone, like a recording slowing to a stop. My vision narrowed to a tiny, dark tunnel. The world tilted, and the last thing I saw was the shocked face of the man sitting next to me as I slumped out of my chair and the floor rushed up to meet me. Then blackness. But my awareness did not cease. For a split second, I was a disembodied observer, my consciousness untethered from the failing body on the floor. And from this new, strange perspective, I saw one last terrible thing. I saw Susan, her face a mask of pure, abject horror as she watched me fall. Her hand flew to her mouth, and then I watched as her own eyes went wide with a different kind of shock, a physical agony. She clutched her own chest, a silent, desperate gasp on her lips, and then she too collapsed to the floor. The chaos of the room, the screams, the people rushing forward, it all began to fade into a profound and all-encompassing silence. The anger was gone. The pain was gone, and I was floating, weightless and calm, looking down at the two bodies on the floor of the community center, mine and my enemy's. There in the profound and sudden silence, I floated. The chaos of the room below unfolded like a silent film. I saw people rushing forward, faces a blur of panic and confusion. I saw paramedics burst through the doors, their movements efficient and urgent as they began to work on the two bodies on the floor. It was the strangest, most detached sensation. There was no pain, there was no fear. There was only a quiet, clinical observation. And in that quiet, my first coherent thought was not one of grief for my own lost life, but one of grim, righteous satisfaction. I looked down at the tragic scene, my body and hers, and I saw it not as a tragedy, but as a validation, as the final, irrefutable proof in my lifelong argument. I saw myself as a martyr for the cause of justice, struck down in the very act of speaking truth to power. I saw her as a casualty of her own bigotry, her weak heart unable to withstand the force of the truth I had delivered. In my mind, as my soul was just beginning its journey into eternity, I was already preparing my case. I felt a sense of vindication, an expectation that I was about to be welcomed into the arms of a God who would surely say, "Well done, my good and faithful warrior. You fought the good fight, you were on the right side of history and on the right side of heaven." I was so certain, I was so sure. Then I felt it, a gentle but insistent pull, like the current of a slow-moving river, drawing me upward and away. I tried to keep my focus on the scene below, my mind still replaying the argument, still sharpening the points I had made against Susan, but the world began to fade. The community center, the shocked faces, the two bodies on the floor, it all grew smaller and smaller, like a photograph shrinking into a pinpoint of light. I was being pulled into a tunnel of soft, swirling, and beautiful light. I was being drawn into what I assumed was the courtroom of heaven, and I was ready to testify. I was ready for justice. The tunnel of light opened into a realm of perfect peace. All the noise, all the anger, all the weight of my earthly battle was gone. I was standing in the presence of a love so pure and so complete that it was the very air I was now breathing. I knew, with an instinct that transcended all my academic knowledge, that I was in the presence of Jesus. I could feel his power, his holiness, and his absolute authority. But the first and most overwhelming emotion that radiated from him, the very first wave of his being that washed over my soul, was not what I expected. It was not a triumphant welcome for a fallen warrior. It was a deep, profound, and heavy sorrow. It was a sadness so pure and so vast it made my own lifelong grief over injustice feel like a single teardrop in an endless ocean. It was the unmistakable, heartbreaking grief of a loving father watching his children tear each other apart. And in my pride, in my self-righteous certainty, I immediately assumed I knew the cause of his sorrow. Yes, my soul thought with a grim satisfaction, he sees, he understands. I believed his heart was breaking for the same reasons mine was. I believed he was weeping with me for the sin of racism, for the blindness of the ignorant, for the injustice of a world that would allow a woman like Susan to have a platform. I felt a profound sense of unity with him, a feeling of being completely and totally vindicated. I had been on the right side of the fight, and here was the King of the universe grieving alongside me. My righteous anger felt validated, sanctified, holy. But then, in the midst of my prideful assumption, he turned the full focus of his presence upon me. I felt his gaze, a gaze of pure, refining light, and in that gaze I felt the sorrow. But this time it was not a shared sorrow for the world. It was a specific, piercing, and heartbreaking sorrow for me. It was not a look of condemnation. It was a look of pure, paternal grief. In that terrible, loving gaze, I was shown my own heart as he saw it. I saw my righteous anger, but I also saw the bitterness that had taken root beneath it. I saw my passion for justice, but I also saw the ugly pride that had grown alongside it. I saw my love for my people, but I also saw my cold, unforgiving hatred for my enemies. I saw, with a clarity that shattered my soul, that in my long and noble war against the poison of racism, I had allowed the poison of hatred to find a home in my own heart. In that moment, I saw the truth. He was not just grieving for the sin of my enemy, he was grieving for me. The revelation of the sickness in my own heart left me speechless, my spiritual feet knocked out from under me. My entire identity as a righteous warrior, a champion of the oppressed, was now in question. I had spent my life pointing out the speck in my brother's eye and had been blind to the great wooden beam in my own. In my confusion, I could only look to Jesus, my soul a silent question. Then what is the truth? If my righteous anger is also a poison, what is right? In response, he did not give me a new set of rules. He gave me a new perspective. You see the world through a single, powerful lens, Aaliyah. His thought was that of a master teacher, gentle but firm, the lens of justice. It is a good and a holy lens, but it is only half of the picture. Let me show you how heaven sees. The scene around me transformed. Before me, a magnificent and cosmic set of scales materialized out of the living light. They were not forged from cold metal, but from pure, unshakable truth, and they hung in a perfect, divine balance. Jesus gestured to the scale on the left. This, he said, is the scale of my perfect justice. As I looked at it, I was shown visions within the scale. I saw the anguish of slaves in the belly of a ship. I saw the tears of a mother whose son had been unjustly killed. I saw every broken treaty, every stolen piece of land, every act of oppression and prejudice throughout the history of my nation. And I felt the holy, righteous, and absolute demand of the scale, that every wrong must be made right, every tear must be accounted for, and every debt of sin must be paid in full. I felt a surge of validation. This was the scale I had served my whole life. Then Jesus gestured to the scale on the right. And this, he said, is the scale of my boundless mercy. As I looked at that scale, I saw a different set of visions. I saw a thief on a cross, a man whose life of crime was undeniable, being welcomed into paradise with his last breath. I saw a woman caught in adultery, surrounded by her accusers, being told to go and sin no more. I saw the nail-scarred hands of Jesus himself, stretched out not in judgment, but in loving invitation. And I felt the power of this scale, a scandalous, illogical, and overwhelming grace that declared every debt was already forgiven, every sin already paid for. I recoiled slightly. As a historian, as an activist, this scale was uncomfortable. It felt unjust. Humanity in its brokenness cannot hold both of these truths in balance, Jesus explained. You choose one scale to champion over the other. America and your own heart, Aaliyah, have become dangerously obsessed with the scale of justice. In your righteous and correct demand for wrongs to be made right, you have forgotten the power and the necessity of the scale of mercy. You have forgotten, he said, and his gaze pierced my soul, that the only reason you yourself can stand in my presence now is because of this scale, not that one. The truth of his words hit me. I, too, was a sinner, in need of a mercy I had become unwilling to grant to others. A world with only justice is a world of endless retribution, an eternal cycle of vengeance. A world with only mercy is a world without truth or consequence. But heaven, his kingdom, operates on the perfect, paradoxical, and beautiful balance of both. I stared at the two scales, my entire black and white worldview shattered into a million shades of a divine and complex gray. And I wondered, what did this have to do with the woman I hated? As I stood there, reeling from the revelation of heaven's two scales, Jesus answered the question that was burning in my soul. To understand the balance his thought communicated, its gentle authority leaving no room for argument, you must first witness an accounting. You will now stand as a witness to the judgment of the soul of Susan. The name hit me with a jolt. I was not just going to be taught a theological lesson, I was being called to the witness stand for the very woman I considered my enemy. A grim, cold satisfaction, the last remnant of my earthly pride, rose within me. Finally, a dark part of my soul whispered, "Justice." I braced myself, expecting to see the ignorance and prejudice of her life laid bare, to see the scale of justice claim its rightful weight, to finally be vindicated. The scene shifted. The spirit of Susan materialized before the presence of Jesus. She did not look like the confident, defiant woman from the community meeting. She looked small, old, and utterly terrified, her soul trembling in the light of perfect truth. Then her life review began, but it was not the simple slideshow of racist remarks I had expected. Jesus was showing me not just her actions, but the very roots from which those actions grew. I was shown Susan as a little girl, sitting at a dinner table in the 1960s, listening as her own father spoke with a casual, unthinking prejudice that was as common as the air he breathed. I saw that she was not taught active hatred, but she was absorbing a deep and subtle poison, a fear of the other. The vision moved forward. I saw her as an adult, living her entire life in a quiet, homogeneous suburban bubble, her worldview shaped almost exclusively by the fearful, angry voices on her favorite cable news channel. I was shown what she saw every night, a constant stream of images and stories that portrayed people who looked like me not as neighbors or fellow citizens, but as threats, as criminals, as a danger to her way of life. The vision then went deeper, and I was made to feel her inner state. And what I felt was not the hot, arrogant fire of a supremacist. What I felt was the cold, gnawing, and constant whisper of fear. She was afraid of a changing world. She was afraid of losing the America she knew. She was afraid of the very people she had never truly known. Dr. Aaliyah Washington, the historian, was being shown the history of a single, frightened soul. I saw that her prejudice was not a weapon she had forged in malice, but a shield she had constructed out of ignorance and fear. It did not excuse her words or their impact, but it recontextualized them. I was no longer looking at a simple villain. I was looking at a prisoner, a woman trapped in a cage of inherited bias and carefully cultivated fear. My righteous anger began to feel complicated. The clear, sharp lines of my moral certainty began to blur. The life review concluded, and Susan stood before Jesus, her flawed, fearful, and ignorant life now fully exposed. I saw her life, I saw the fear, I saw the damage her words had caused. It was all there, and still, I waited for the hammer of justice to fall. The record of Susan's life, a long and sad story of fear and inherited ignorance, was now complete. She stood before the throne of Jesus, a trembling, terrified soul, utterly exposed. My own heart, the heart of a professor who had spent her life weighing historical evidence, rendered its verdict. The evidence of her prejudice was clear. The impact of her ignorant words was undeniable. Justice, the perfect and holy scale of justice, demanded a reckoning. I steeled myself, ready to witness the righteous and necessary condemnation that her life had earned. I waited for the hammer to fall. But Jesus was not looking at the 70-year-old woman trembling before him. His gaze, the gaze that sees all of time in a single moment, was looking at a different scene entirely. And he showed it to me. The vision shifted. It was no longer the heavenly court. It was a summer night in the 1960s. I was standing by a crackling campfire, surrounded by the sounds of crickets and the smell of pine. A group of young girls, maybe 10 years old, were singing a simple song about Jesus. And among them was Susan, a little girl with bright, hopeful eyes, not yet filled with the fear and suspicion I had seen. Her face was earnest, her voice was clear, and as she sang, tears streamed down her young cheeks. And in the quiet of her own heart, I heard her whisper a simple, almost forgotten prayer. Jesus, I don't know much, but I believe you're real. Please come into my heart. I want to be yours. It was a single, uncorrupted moment of pure, childlike faith. The vision of the campfire faded, and we were back in the great hall of heaven. Jesus looked at the old, terrified soul of Susan, but he was not addressing her. He was speaking to the little girl at the campfire, and the words he spoke were not of judgment, but of recognition. I heard you then, Susan, and I have never forgotten. He smiled, a smile of overwhelming, scandalous grace. Welcome home, my daughter. In that instant, all the fear, all the ignorance, all the prejudice was burned away from her spiritual form, not by a fire of judgment, but by a fire of pure, unmerited love. She became radiant, whole, and joyful, and I watched, my soul screaming in silent protest, as angels welcomed my enemy into paradise. A wave of profound, righteous outrage, an emotion so powerful it was almost physically painful, ripped through me. But what about justice? My spirit cried out to Jesus. What about the pain she caused, the system she upheld? What about the words she spoke just before she died? You just ignore all that. All of it wiped away because of one prayer she said when she was 10 years old. How is that just? How is that fair? I felt utterly betrayed. The God of justice I had fought for my entire life had just performed an act that, to my eyes, was the ultimate injustice. The scales were broken. I stared at the empty space where the woman I hated had just been glorified, and I turned my gaze to Jesus, my entire being a single, heartbroken, and furious question: how could you? My furious, silent question, how could you, hung in the holy air, a testament to my shattered understanding of justice. In my world, in the history I had studied and the life I had lived, there was a clear equation. Righteous action leads to reward, and prejudiced action leads to condemnation. What I had just witnessed had broken that equation. I expected a rebuke from Jesus for my anger, a correction for my impertinence. Instead, his presence simply absorbed my rage, and his response was not one of defense, but of a calm, loving, and world-altering instruction. First, he affirmed me. Aaliyah, his thought was a soothing balm on my wounded sense of justice. Your passion for justice is not wrong. It is a beautiful and holy reflection of my own heart. I hate oppression, I despise prejudice. I weep with every act of injustice committed in my world. Your fight on earth to make wrongs right, to speak for the voiceless, is a good, righteous, and necessary fight. Do not think that your work has been in vain. As he spoke, I was shown a brief, affirming vision of my own life, of my in a classroom, a student's eyes lighting up with understanding, of me at a peaceful march, my voice clear and strong. He was showing me that my life's work did matter. It was a moment of profound validation that disarmed my anger and opened my heart to hear the difficult truth that was to follow. But he continued, and the entire weight of eternity was in that single word: you have come to believe that my justice is my only attribute. In your focus on the scales, you have forgotten the cross. You have forgotten that the very foundation of my kingdom is not justice, but grace. He looked at me, his gaze holding both the fire of perfect justice and the ocean of perfect love, and he delivered the truth that would forever reframe my universe. You have spent your life fighting for people to get what they deserve. I died so that they could receive what they do not deserve. Your work is a reflection of my holy law. My sacrifice was an expression of my boundless love. Both are my will. I struggled to comprehend the paradox. How could both be his will? Earthly justice, he explained, is a temporary and necessary restraint for a broken world. It is a gift I give to limit evil and protect the innocent. But the economy of heaven, the very currency of salvation, is not based on the scale of earthly justice at all. If it were, no one would cross the chasm, not Susan, and not you. The words hit me with a quiet, devastating force. He showed me my own heart again, but this time in the context of his perfect holiness. I saw that my pride in my own intellect, my bitterness, my unforgiveness toward my enemies in the eyes of a holy God, these were just as much a part of the chasm of sin as Susan's ignorance. Before the cross, all our sins are equal in their power to separate us from God, and all our righteousness is equally powerless to bridge the gap. In my fight for justice, I had forgotten that I myself was a sinner, saved only by the very mercy I was so unwilling to grant to my enemy. The profound truth of heavenly mercy, the scandalous grace that had welcomed my enemy home, was still settling in my soul. My anger was gone, replaced by a deep and disorienting humility, but a new question now arose. If both Susan and I were flawed, broken people, both equally in need of a grace we didn't deserve, then why had we been such bitter enemies? What was the point of the ugly, painful conflict that had ended both of our lives? I looked to Jesus, my heart now asking not how could you, but why. His response was to pull the curtain back even further, to show me a level of reality I never knew existed. Because you were not truly fighting each other, his thought was a revelation that chilled me to the core. You were both soldiers in a war, manipulated into fighting for the wrong side. You were fighting a proxy war for an enemy you could not see. The vision reformed. I was back in the community center auditorium, an invisible observer of my own final moments. I saw Susan step up to the microphone, her face a mask of nervous conviction. But this time, I saw what was happening in the spiritual realm. Behind her stood a dark, shadowy figure, a spirit of fear. It was whispering into her ear, twisting her genuine, if misguided, concern for her community into the ignorant, coded language that had so enraged me. It was stoking her fear of change, her fear of losing her world, and using that fear to sow a seed of public division. Then I was forced to watch myself. I saw my own face, proud and angry, as I strode to the microphone. And my soul recoiled in horror because I saw that standing behind me, its shadowy hands on my shoulders, was another dark spirit. It was not a spirit of fear, but one of pride and of bitter, righteous anger. As I began to speak, I felt its whispers, the same ones that had been my constant companions for years: crush her, show no mercy. Expose her ignorance, make them all see that you are right and she is evil. I watched horrified as I followed its direction perfectly, my sharp, academic words becoming the weapons it wanted me to wield. I realized that the spirits on both sides of the room didn't care who won the argument. Their only goal was that the fight itself would happen. They wanted the wound. They wanted the division. They wanted the hatred that they could then feed on. The terrible, humbling truth was laid bare. Dr. Aaliyah Washington, a warrior for justice, a woman of intellect and strength, had been a puppet. Just as much a puppet as the ignorant woman I had despised. I thought I was fighting for God, but in my pride and unforgiveness, I had opened the door to an enemy that was working directly against God's heart of reconciliation. Susan and I were never the true enemies. We were just two opposing pawns on a cosmic chessboard, being moved and manipulated by the same dark, unseen player. Now you see the true enemy, Aaliyah. The voice of Jesus was a solemn confirmation of this horrifying truth. But to fight him effectively, you must first understand the ground he has gained in your own heart. The vision of the spiritual puppeteers, the architects of division, faded. I was left with the sickening realization that I had been a pawn in a war I didn't even know was being fought. The focus of Jesus then turned from the great, cosmic battle back to the small, intimate battlefield of my own heart. The atmosphere was no longer that of a courtroom or a celestial balcony. It felt like a quiet, private consultation with the great physician, and I was the patient with the terminal diagnosis. Your anger at injustice was a gift from me, Aaliyah. His thought was gentle, and it began by affirming the very thing I now felt so confused about. I am the one who placed that fire for justice in your soul. It is the same fire that caused me to turn over the tables in the temple. It is a holy fire. I felt a flicker of my old self-righteousness, of validation. But then he continued, and his words were a loving but unsparing scalpel. But any gift that is not held in constant surrender to the giver can become an idol, and your righteous anger, my child, became your God. You began to serve the fight more than you served me. To help me understand, he showed me a vision of my own heart. First, he showed it to me as it was 20 years ago when I was just beginning my career. It was a beautiful, vibrant thing, soft and full of a passionate but compassionate fire. Its desire for justice was pure, and it was balanced by a deep, sorrowful love for all people, even those on the wrong side of history. Then he showed me my heart as it was on the day I died. I recoiled in horror. It was no longer soft and vibrant. It had become like stone, a hard, gray, calcified thing. It was strong, yes. It was an impenetrable fortress of moral certainty and historical fact. But it was also cold, brittle, and incapable of being moved by mercy. I saw that the poison of bitterness and unforgiveness, which I had been drinking daily from the well of the world's injustices, had caused this terrible hardening. You have fought well for the oppressed, Jesus said, his voice full of a sorrowful love. This is good, and it pleases my Father's heart. But I gave you two great commandments, to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. He paused, and his next question pierced through my stone-like defenses. And I also commanded you to love your enemies. Tell me, Aaliyah, you who have memorized the histories of 1,000 injustices, when was the last time you truly, from your heart, wept for the soul of your oppressor? When was the last time you prayed not for their defeat, but for their redemption? I had no answer. The terrible truth was that I had stopped seeing them as lost souls in need of a savior. I had started seeing them only as obstacles, as enemies, as problems to be defeated. In my quest to win the war for justice, I had become a casualty. The enemy could not extinguish my fire for justice, so instead, he had skillfully tricked me into letting it burn away my mercy. He was right. I had become a brilliant, effective, and merciless soldier, and I was fighting a holy war with a heart that had become unholy. The diagnosis of my own hardened heart was a truth more painful than any historical fact I had ever unearthed. I, a fighter for justice, stood convicted of mercilessness. I, a woman who spoke of truth, was shown the great lie I had been living. My fortress of self-righteousness crumbled into dust, and in that place of utter brokenness, my soul cried out for the first time without any pretense, without any justification. Lord, I was wrong, forgive me, heal my heart. The response from Jesus was not a condemnation, but an immediate and loving prescription for my new life. Your mission is not over, Aaliyah. His thought was a current of pure, restorative power. I am not silencing your voice for justice. The world needs that voice. My oppressed children need that voice to speak for them with courage and clarity. You will return. A wave of relief and purpose washed over me. My life's work was not a mistake. But then he added the new, paradoxical, and infinitely more difficult part of the commission. But from this day forward, you must become a witness for mercy as well. The great cosmic scales of heaven materialized before me again, hanging in their perfect, divine balance. Your new calling, he declared, is to teach a divided and warring nation how to hold both of these scales in balance. You will continue to fight fiercely for what is right, but you must do it with a heart that has been made soft, a heart that can still break for the very people you are fighting against. You will speak truth to power, but your words must now be seasoned with grace, not just with anger. He was giving me a new weapon, a weapon far more powerful than the righteous fury I had wielded my whole life. My old weapon was truth alone. My new weapon was to be truth spoken in love. To show me what this looked like, he gave me a brief, powerful vision of my own future. I saw myself on a stage, speaking to a large, divided crowd. I was speaking with the same passion for justice, my voice clear and strong as I called out injustice. But the tone was different. The hard, cutting edge of my anger was gone, replaced by a deep, sorrowful love. I watched as I spoke not just about my opponents, but to them, acknowledging their fears, the very fears I had been shown in Susan's life before I critiqued their ideas. I saw the faces in the crowd change. The angry, defensive walls began to come down. This new way was not weaker, it was devastatingly powerful. It was disarming the very spirits of division because it refused to use their own weapon of hatred against them. The vision faded and I understood. I was being sent back not to be a warrior for one side, but to be a bridge between two. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and holy, that the life of a bridge is to be walked on from both directions. The truth of my new commission, to be a bridge, settled upon me not with a feeling of triumphant joy, but with the heavy, sober weight of a soldier being given a near impossible assignment. I understood immediately what it meant. A bridge is not a fortress. A bridge has no sides. A bridge's entire purpose is to be walked on, sometimes trampled on, from both directions, in the service of connecting two shores that would otherwise remain separate and at war. To make sure I fully understood the cost of this calling, Jesus showed me one final, difficult vision of the life I would be returning to. I saw myself sometime in the future, standing in a room with my old friends and allies, the very people I had fought alongside for years in the battle for racial justice. I was sharing my new message, speaking of the need for mercy, of the spiritual danger of bitterness, of the command to love and pray for our enemies, and I saw the looks on their faces. It was not agreement, it was confusion, then disappointment, and finally a cold, hard look of betrayal. I could hear their thoughts, their whispers: she's gone soft, she's lost her fire, she's a traitor to the cause. I felt the profound, cutting pain of being rejected by my own tribe, the people whose approval I had valued most. Then the vision shifted, and I saw myself reaching out to the other side, to people like Susan's family and friends. They did not welcome me with open arms. They looked at me with deep suspicion, seeing my new message of grace as some kind of liberal trick, a more subtle form of attack. The path of a bridge builder, I saw, was a profoundly lonely one. The vision of my personal future faded, and Jesus scaled the lesson up one last time to deliver the full and urgent warning for my nation. The great scales of heaven appeared before me again, hanging in their perfect, divine balance. America is a nation on the verge of destroying itself because it has forgotten this balance. His voice resonated with the authority of a king and the sorrow of a prophet. One side screams for justice without mercy, and that becomes a tyranny of self-righteousness. The other side offers a false peace without justice, and that becomes the cowardice of compromise. Both are an abomination to me. Both are paths that lead to the overflowing of the river of blood. He looked at me, and I felt the full weight of his charge. The nation does not need more warriors for one side or the other. It needs healers, it needs weavers to mend the torn tapestry. It needs bridge builders who are willing to stand in the lonely, difficult middle and call both sides back to a higher way. I understood my commission. It was the hardest, loneliest, and most important work a person could be called to, and in the holy silence of that place, I accepted it. The moment I accepted the commission, the peaceful reality of heaven began to recede. My soul ached with a sorrowful goodbye, the pain of an exile being sent away from her true home. I felt the familiar, irresistible pull of the physical world, a heavy gravity reclaiming its own. The journey back was not a gentle float through a pearlescent tunnel, it was a violent fall, a chaotic tumble through a roaring darkness. The light of heaven was extinguished, and the holy silence was replaced by the rushing, deafening sound of my return to the world of noise and time. I felt my boundless spirit being compressed, squeezed back into the painful and restrictive confines of a broken human body. The first sensation was a blinding, explosive pain in my head. The second was the frantic, high-pitched beeping of a heart monitor. The third was the sound of a voice, thick with panic, shouting, "We've got a rhythm, she has a pulse." I took a huge, ragged gasp, and the air that filled my lungs felt like fire and glass. My eyes flew open to the harsh, sterile glare of an emergency room light. Faces in blue scrubs hovered over me, their expressions a mixture of professional focus and utter disbelief. I was back, the mission was real, but the peace, the clarity, the loving presence of Jesus was gone, replaced by the brutal, confusing reality of a body in trauma. A doctor was shining a light in my eyes, saying my name. "Dr. Washington, can you hear me? Can you squeeze my hand?" I could hear him, but his voice was a distant echo. My mind was not in that emergency room. It was 1,000 miles away, 1,000,000 miles away, still standing on the edge of that great chasm, wrestling with the divine paradox I had just witnessed. The doctors were celebrating a medical miracle, the inexplicable return of a woman who had been clinically dead for nearly 10 minutes with no brain activity. They were marveling at the fact that I was alive. But my soul was in a state of profound and agonizing turmoil. Over and over, a single world-shattering fact replayed in my mind, a truth so radical and so contrary to my entire life's work that I could barely contain it. Susan is in heaven, the woman whose ignorance I had despised, the woman who represented a system I had sworn to dismantle, the woman who was the object of my final, fatal burst of anger was in heaven. The scale of justice had been overridden by the scale of mercy. My entire fortress of righteous certainty had been leveled to the ground. The doctors celebrated my return to life, but I was grieving a death far more profound, the death of my own simple, black and white understanding of the universe. I had been sent back with a message of balance, but my own soul felt impossibly, terrifyingly out of balance. It has been several years since that day in the community center, the day I died and was reborn. The journey since my return has not been easy. I had to learn to live in a world that I now saw with new and often painful clarity. I had to learn to carry the weight of the impossible truth I was shown, that the woman I had despised was now in a state of grace, and that my own righteous heart had been on a path toward darkness. Some of my old allies in the fight for justice could not understand my new message. They saw my talk of mercy as a betrayal, a weakening of the cause. They called me a compromiser, and perhaps in their eyes I am, but I am no longer fighting their war, I am fighting his. And so I stand before you today, not as the same woman who died on that floor, but as a witness to a truth that is both more just and more merciful than we can comprehend. My life is still dedicated to the fight for justice. That calling has not changed. The scale of justice is holy, and we must never stop demanding that its balance be honored here on earth. We must never stop speaking for the voiceless or fighting for the oppressed. But I was shown another scale, a scale our angry, broken world has forgotten, the scale of mercy. And I am here to deliver the warning I was given. A nation or a soul that seeks only justice without mercy is a nation that will inevitably destroy itself, for it is fighting against the very heart of the God who created it. I saw a vision of a coming civil war, a river of blood fed by our hatred, but I was also shown the cure. The cure is the impossible, scandalous, and world-altering choice to love our enemies, to look at the Susans in our own lives, the people whose ignorance, fear, and prejudice drive us to a righteous rage, and to ask God to let us see the wounded, frightened child behind their angry words. It is the hardest work a human heart can be called to do. It is the work of becoming a bridge. And it is the only thing that will heal our land, so I leave you with this. Fight for justice, yes. Fight for it with all your passion and all your strength. But do so with a heart that has been broken and made soft by grace, a heart that has room for both the righteous demand for justice and the radical healing power of mercy. For it is only by holding both of those sacred scales in balance that we can ever hope to truly reflect the heart of our God.